In the vast library of Ethiopian Christianity, where parchment scrolls whisper of prophets, kings, and heavenly visions, few questions have stirred as much curiosity as the destiny of the sons of Ishmael, the people from whom Islam would later arise. The Ethiopian Bible, the most complete and ancient Christian canon in existence, carries within its pages a prophetic thread that begins with Abraham and stretches across centuries, reaching into the spiritual history of Arabia. Though it never mentions Islam by name, for Islam would not appear until 6 centuries after Christ, the Ethiopian scriptures and the commentaries of the early fathers in Ge'ez language reveal how Ethiopia interpreted the rise of Ishmael's descendants and the meaning of their place in God's plan. To understand this mystery, one must return to Genesis, where the seed of Ishmael's destiny was first spoken. In the book of Genesis 16, the angel of the Lord appears to Hagar, the Egyptian servant of Sarah, and announces that her son will be called Ishmael, meaning God hears. The angel says, "He shall be a wild man, his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren." In the Ethiopian Bible written in Ge'ez, this verse is rendered with an added depth of tone. "Ishmael wilt thou do, stand among his brothers," a phrase Ethiopian commentators took not merely as a prophecy of conflict, but of enduring presence. That the line of Ishmael would never disappear from history, and that its hand would always influence the destiny of nations. Ethiopian exegetes, centuries before the rise of Islam, regarded the Ishmaelites as a people chosen for a specific purpose, not for covenant. As Isaac's line was but for witness, for through them, the world would be reminded that God hears even those outside the chosen promise. Early Ethiopian commentaries preserved in monastic libraries, such as Debre Libanos and Debre Damo, include reflections that associate Ishmael's descendants with the vast deserts of Arabia and the wandering tribes that would one day carry both trade and belief across the Red Sea. The Ethiopian Church, sitting as it does at the meeting point of Africa and Arabia, always held a unique view of these peoples. They were both neighbor and mystery. When Islam arose in the 7th century, Ethiopia was not surprised. In fact, Ethiopian chroniclers later wrote that the coming of this new faith had already been seen in spirit by the fathers of the church. The Kebra Nagast, though not speaking directly of Islam, preserves a worldview that shaped how Ethiopians understood every rising empire. It teaches that every kingdom on earth appears by the permission of God and serves a purpose in the unfolding story of salvation. According to this logic, the rise of the sons of Ishmael was not an accident of history, but a turning of divine design, a movement allowed by heaven to test, to refine, and to remind the nations of the one God. In the Ethiopian Christian understanding, prophecy is not frozen in a single moment, it lives. Monks reading Genesis saw in Ishmael's story a cycle that repeats throughout history. Men blessed with hearing, but tempted toward pride. Men chosen for greatness, yet drawn to independence from covenant. The Ethiopian fathers connected Ishmael's wilderness life with the spiritual state of nations that live by strength and law, but not by grace. When they later witnessed the emergence of a powerful monotheistic people across the Red Sea, a people who revered Abraham, honored Jesus as prophet, and yet denied his divinity, they saw the prophecy continuing. In their view, the hand of Ishmael was again against his brothers, not in malice but in separation, a parallel line of faith that God would one day reconcile. Ethiopian chronicles such as the Futur al-Habasha, the conquest of Abyssinia, and older annals record encounters between Ethiopian Christians and early Muslim refugees. The story of the first Hijrah, when the followers of the Prophet Muhammad fled persecution in Mecca and were received by the Christian king of Aksum, became in Ethiopian memory a fulfillment of ancient hospitality. The Negus, King Armah or Ashama ibn Abjar as some sources call him, heard the Muslims recite verses about Jesus and Mary and declared, "Truly, this and what we have are from the same source." Ethiopian tradition treated this as a sign that even in the rise of Islam, God's mercy extended across boundaries. Monks later wrote that the children of Ishmael came seeking refuge, and God made Ethiopia their shelter. In this reading, Ethiopia became a bridge between covenants, between those who confessed Christ as Lord and those who revered him as prophet. Yet the Ethiopian fathers also warned that Ishmael's destiny was not complete. In Ge'ez, commentaries on Isaiah and Daniel, copied during the Middle Ages, there are passages that interpret the king of the south and the desert kings as symbols of rising powers from Arabia. These texts do not condemn but observe. They describe how God uses every nation to accomplish his will. One manuscript from the monastery of Debre Haik calls the rise of the southern kingdoms a rod of discipline for those who forget God. In this sense, the Ethiopian reading sees the Islamic expansion not as random conquest, but as a divine correction in history, a reminder to a sleeping Christendom that the knowledge of one God must not be taken for granted. Ethiopian scholars drew parallels between Ishmael's blessing, "I will make of him a great nation," and the astonishing spread of Arab power after the 7th century. This was not viewed as a curse, but as the unfolding of God's word. Ishmael's line was destined for greatness, though its fullness would only be realized when it recognized the Son whom the Father sent. Through the lens of the Ethiopian Bible, prophecy is never limited to geography. The descendants of Ishmael stand for every nation that lives near truth, but not yet within it, every people that hears, but does not yet see. Ethiopian theologians often used Ishmael and Isaac as symbols of two covenants, not to condemn one, but to show how mercy operates in stages. The Book of Jubilees and the First Enoch, both canonical in the Ethiopian tradition, reinforce this concept. Jubilees recounts that Abraham prayed for Ishmael to be blessed, and God answered him. Enoch speaks of nations that walk in brightness after correction. When read together, these texts offered Ethiopian Christians a prophetic map. Ishmael's sons would wander, rise, and one day face the invitation of the everlasting covenant. In later centuries, Ethiopian writers such as Abba Georgis of Gassicha and Abba Salama used this framework to interpret the continued presence of Islam around them. They lived in a land surrounded by Muslim neighbors and sometimes ruled by Muslim sultans. Yet their writings show neither hatred nor despair. Instead, they speak of patience. One 15th century Ge'ez sermon describes God as a farmer who planted two fields, one of covenant, the church, and one of obedience, the nations. The preacher says, "The Lord waits until both fields are ripe before the harvest." To Ethiopian eyes, Islam's endurance signified purpose, not accident. It was a nation under divine patience, destined for encounter, not destruction. This understanding differs sharply from medieval European interpretations that saw Islam purely as an enemy of Christendom. The Ethiopian vision was older, shaped by proximity and memory. Ethiopians had lived beside Arabia since the time of the Queen of Sheba. Their faith had spread long before the Latin West even knew the name of Mecca. Their prophets and poets saw patterns that others missed. They read in the story of Ishmael not merely separation but promise, a divine tension awaiting resolution. The Kebra Nagast reminds readers that the true king is not measured by throne or sword, but by the ark of God presence. Therefore, any power that forgets mercy, whether Christian or Muslim, strays from its destiny. This principle allowed Ethiopians to interpret the rise of Islamic kingdoms both as judgment and as invitation. In the prophetic imagination of the Ethiopian Church, the destiny of Ishmael's sons was tied to the end of the age, when all nations would stand before the throne of God. Certain Ge'ez apocalyptic texts, such as the Book of the Mysteries of Heaven and Earth, a work often read in monasteries, describe how nations of the south and east will bring their gifts to Zion in the last days. The commentators identified these nations broadly, some being descendants of Cush, others of Sheba, and still others of Ishmael. The language is symbolic but striking. They shall come with their crescent crowns and lay them at the foot of the cross. This imagery was not political propaganda, but theological poetry, a vision that one day, even those who rose outside the covenant would bow not by force, but by revelation. To understand how the Ethiopian Bible frames this, one must grasp its central theme. God's mercy is progressive. The scriptures tell of stages: hearing, seeing, believing. Ishmael's very name, God hears, fits that pattern. Ethiopians read it as the first step. The sons of Ishmael were the people whom God heard. Isaac, meaning laughter, symbolized joy and revelation. Thus, the two brothers represent the two moments of salvation, hearing and rejoicing. In this symbolic reading, Islam's rise fulfilled the first, for it revived the confession of one God in a world drowning in idols. The second, the joy of revelation, remains the promise of future grace. Ethiopian manuscripts from the 14th and 15th centuries include prayers for the children of the desert. These prayers ask that they may see the light of the Word as they have heard the voice of the One. This prayer is consistent with Ethiopia's ancient theology of inclusion. Salvation history moves outward, not inward. It expands like ripples on water. The presence of Islam, therefore, was interpreted as a step in that outward expansion. A nation prepared by monotheism, awaiting completion in revelation. Historically, Ethiopian emperors such as Zara Yacob took this theology seriously. His writings and proclamations, preserved in Ge'ez, show that he viewed Islamic states around Ethiopia as both challenge and opportunity. He commanded his scribes to copy scriptures in Arabic so that those who revered the word might read it. He sent envoys not merely as diplomats, but as witnesses. To him, the destiny of Islam was not annihilation, but encounter, the meeting of faiths under one creator. Theologically, Ethiopian teachers explained this using the image of the two brothers of Abraham. As Isaac carried the line of promise, Ishmael carried the line of providence. Both were necessary. Without Ishmael, the story of hearing would be incomplete. Without Isaac, the story of joy would lack fulfillment. Thus, Ethiopia's vision of the world was dual yet harmonious. Every nation plays a part in revealing the fullness of God. Islam's rise was a loud echo of God's voice in history, calling the world back to monotheism when many had fallen to paganism. Its destiny, however, according to Ethiopian eschatology, ends not in domination but in illumination, when hearing gives way to seeing and seeing to worship. The Ethiopian Bible closes with Revelation's vision of nations walking in the light of the Lamb. Ethiopian monks reading that passage saw every empire, every people, including those of Ishmael, in that light. They believed that when Scripture says, "The kings of the earth shall bring their glory into it," it includes all, even those once outside. Therefore, the destiny of Islam, from the Ethiopian viewpoint, is ultimately the destiny of all humanity. To move from hearing to understanding, from zeal to truth, from law to grace. In conclusion, the Ethiopian Bible does not predict Islam by name, nor does it curse it. It places the sons of Ishmael within a grand, unfolding divine story, a story of hearing God's voice, rising in power, and awaiting the final revelation of his Son. Ethiopia, sitting at the crossroads of Africa and Arabia, watched this prophecy play out in real history. To Ethiopian Christians, Islam's existence is neither accident nor threat. It is part of a divine equation that teaches that mercy extends beyond covenant and destiny belongs to all who seek the truth. In their vision, the last chapter is not conquest, but conversion of hearts. When every nation, whether of Isaac or Ishmael, stands together before the eternal King, and the promise made to Abraham at the beginning finds its true end, that in his seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed.